Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a significant effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight, our feature is Svetlana Stalin, or Svetlana Alliluyeva, or Lana Peters. But however you say her name, she was Joseph Stalin's daughter, and she died recently at the age of 85. And there are very few people still alive who personally remember Joseph Stalin, one of the notorious tyrants of the 20th century, a man so infamous that he is still feared within the Soviet Union. The story of his daughter, Svetlana Alliluyeva, is amazing because 15 years after his death, she emigrated to the United States. She defected, as it were, and she spent the rest of her life traveling around the world. She never really found herself. The obituary hasn't really been well told here in the United States, despite the fact at the time it was a huge story all over the world. So here's some of the BBC coverage of the story of the life of Joseph Stalin's daughter.
Svetlana Stalina was the last surviving child of the brutal Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. She defected to the West in 1967 and ended her life as Lana Peters, living in the American state of Wisconsin.
I have been and always wanted to be an ordinary person. It was my father who was not an ordinary person, but I always wanted to have nothing in common with that.
But the real story was more complex than that. Svetlana's upbringing was a strange mixture of privilege and fear. Simon Sebag Montefiore is the author of the book Young Stalin.
When I was working in the archives in Stalin's papers, I found a file of Svetlana's own letters to her father. And in these letters, she often pretended that she was the dictator and the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And she would do things like say, I, Svetlana Stalina, do order that all homework be abolished in the entire Soviet Union. And she would then send this and sign it, Svetlana Stalina, first secretary of the Communist Party. And it was then passed around the Politburo table and signed by Stalin and Molotov and Voroshilov and all the leaders. So in one sense, she really was the indulged and loved daughter of the Tsar of Russia.
I was probably the only person who knew other side of him, you see. When I was a child, I saw real tenderness from him. He could be very insecure, I think, inwardly, but he wanted to hide it because he didn't like weakness.
Her childhood is really in two parts. On the surface, idyllic in many ways. A time spent in Crimean and Caucasian resorts for her holidays, and in another sense, terrifying and mysterious. The background to her growing up was the destruction of many of the friends, the grown-up friends of her childhood, and then, of course, the purges themselves. But, of course, the death of her mother at the age of 6, which she was told was due to peritonitis, cast a long shadow. But there was a key moment, about 1943-44, when she read in a copy of London Illustrated News the truth of her mother's suicide, that her mother had actually committed suicide. Then the scales fell from her eyes.
I came onto some article about my father and his life and so on, and where the fact of her suicide was mentioned just apropos, like a well-known event. And I was quite shocked, naturally. I was only 16, and I turned to my grandmother immediately and I said, well, why you didn't tell me the truth?
She fell in love with an older, worldly Jewish screenwriter, Alexei Kapler, and they had this wonderful literary, romantic love affair, which was listened to by the NKVD, so Stalin was able to read all the conversations in person and on the telephone. And this is not one of Stalin's great crimes, I would say, but rather the reaction of a typical Victorian Georgian father who was outraged to find his 16-year-old, 17-year-old daughter having an affair with a 40-something worldly writer and seducer. And Stalin stormed into her bedroom in front of her nanny and slapped her on the face and had the man arrested and exiled.
And I grew up, I was not close to him anymore. And I was rather afraid of him. I was rather preferred to stay away. And when we would meet in the later years, there was practically no conversation between us.
He simply could not tolerate any independence in anybody. I mean, he was the genuine megalomaniac and power addict. He essentially poisoned every love relationship in his life. And of course, the greatest of those relationships was the one with Svetlana that he ruined and destroyed her and damaged her for life. When he died, the family went from being literally the kind of Tsar's children to being nothing.
The fact that he was no more, even though I was a daughter, it was a relief for all us. We all knew that probably going to have some kind of different life now, more freer and all that.
After Stalin's death, Svetlana dropped his name and instead began to use her mother's maiden name. In the 1960s, she fell in love with Brijesh Singh, an Indian communist who was visiting Moscow. When he died in 1967, she was given unprecedented permission to take his ashes home to India.
A Soviet journalist says Stalin's daughter Svetlana has been given permission to leave Russia.
In New Delhi, Svetlana escaped from the KGB agents who were following her and went to the American embassy to seek political asylum.
Defection at first was an enormous blow to Soviet prestige. It was a massive humiliation for the Soviet Union.
Having settled in the United States, Svetlana became a propaganda weapon in the Cold War. She publicly burned her Soviet passport, denounced her father as a monster, and called the Soviet system profoundly corrupt.
Let me break in here to mention that Svetlana Stalin had two brothers. One brother was captured by the Nazis in World War II, and the Germans offered to trade him for a field marshal, for Field Marshal Friedrich von Paulus, who was the field marshal who was captured at Stalingrad, who the Nazis badly wanted back for his failure at Stalingrad. And Stalin refused to trade von Paulus for his own son, and his son was ultimately killed by the Nazis in Sachsenhausen prison camp. Svetlana's other brother, Stalin's other son, died of alcoholism in the Soviet Union. When Svetlana came to the United States, as Matthew Bannister mentioned, she became a propaganda tool, and here is a very famous interview that she gave to American reporters.
20 years ago, when I joined the Communist Party as a student of Moscow University, I believed in communism as everybody, all my friends, people of my generation did. And I was taught it since my childhood. And perhaps the studies of history and social sciences and economics and Marxism itself made me a little bit critical to many things which I could see around me and to the things I could see in our country and in other socialist countries, because it was not exactly what we were taught theoretically. Later, after my father's death, I can say that perhaps I have lost quite a lot with his death, because he was always for me the authority which could not be, well, I loved him, I respected him, and when he was gone, I have lost maybe a lot of faith, just personal faith and respect. Of course, I disapprove many things, but I think that many other people who still are in our Central Committee and Politburo should be responsible for the same things for which he alone was accused. And if I feel somebody responsible for those horrible things, killing people, injustice, I feel that responsible for this was and is the party, the regime, and the ideology as a whole.
So you can tell even there was an ambivalence to her about her father, who was a mass murderer, but still her father. Unfortunately, she didn't want to be a propaganda tool, and this left her with a sense of unease and a sense of drifting for the rest of her life. Here's a little bit more from the BBC.
Her personal life took an unusual turn when she married William Peters, who'd been an apprentice of the architect Frank Lloyd Wright. Svetlana became Lana Peters, and the couple moved into Wright's famous desert compound in Arizona under the stern rule of Wright's widow. I asked Svetlana's publisher, Ilya Levkov, to describe life in the community.
Extreme, that everything was decided, who lives in what room. We're not allowed to make any breakfast or, God forbid, dinner. Everything was regulated. It was truly a totalitarian microcosm. And it's very unusual that the person who escapes a totalitarian regime will land, due to various circumstances, in this particular tiny spot in the desert.
She traveled around the world a lot. She moved from place to place. Do you think she was searching for something?
No question about this. And this indicates not by her physical travel, it's indicated by her change several times of her religion. She was really searching for the peace of her soul, the peace of her mind.
There were many people like myself who were coming to faith through experiences of that godless, terrible, depressing life. It is from the moment when I began to feel that and know that life is gift of God. Then my life became something really valuable. Every moment of it became valuable.
When she's divorced again, she drifted. She actually traveled back to the Soviet Union to live there for a year or so, but then she tired of life in the Soviet Union. She may have been looking for a lover there, and she came back to the United States to live out the rest of her years. She went back to Wisconsin. She lived primarily alone. She didn't have many friends, she didn't have any relatives, and she didn't have much money. And in the end, hers was the pathetic story of a lonely old woman who didn't have much to live on. It's quite a change from the woman who was born the daughter of one of the most powerful men of the 20th century. So that's the story of Svetlana Alliluyeva, Lana Peters. Hers is an amazing story of power and the fall from power. We move on now to Ken Russell, the British film director. He died recently at the age of 84. Not as well known in the United States as he was in Britain, but he did do some great movies, and he is famous for a couple of the things he did. Probably his best movie known here in the United States is his 1969 adaptation of D.H. Lawrence's Women in Love, and that starred two of the main British film actors of the day, Oliver Reed and Alan Bates. It also starred, in my opinion, the best film actress of the second half of the 20th century, our generation's Bette Davis, Glenda Jackson. Glenda Jackson won the Academy Award for Women in Love. Women in Love was a very controversial 1969 film because it showed full frontal male nudity. It had a famous nude wrestling scene between Oliver Reed and Alan Bates, and they were both worried about who had the bigger member. They measured them, and they were about the same, so they carried on with the scene. But Women in Love, still considered a classic today. Here's a brief snip of a little picnic scene with Oliver Reed, Alan Bates, and Glenda Jackson.
Rupert Birkin. Peculiar names we all have. Do you think we've all been singled out, chosen for some extraordinary moment in life? Or are we all cursed with the mark of Cain?
I'm afraid Ursula was a martyred saint. It's been rather difficult to live up to.
And who's Gudrun?
In a Norse myth, Gudrun was a sinner who murdered her husband.
Would you live up to that?
Which would you prefer me to live up to, Mr. Crouch, the sinner or the murderer?
Ah, I see the perpetual struggle has begun.
Ken Russell went on to do a number of unorthodox pictures about the lives of great musicians and composers. Did one about Tchaikovsky, did one about Elgar, did a number of those, and he was widely respected both in Britain and the United States, although he was far better known in Britain. Here is Ben Kingsley talking about Ken Russell.
Well, he was a massive contribution to the language of cinema, and he particularly brought the creative genius to the screen. And it's a very hard thing to do. You can't film creative genius because it's going on inside the person. But his films about great composers were extraordinary. And the way he linked their vulnerability of flesh to the creation of great works of art was very, very clever. And he was a product of his time, really, when cinema had turned a corner and was very exciting and provocative in the 60s, and of course beyond. That's when he first made his impact in cinema. I met him not that long ago. It was lovely to be with him. He was a charming, delightful, highly intelligent man. Big loss to cinema.
And here's some high praise from an American director, Martin Scorsese.
My feelings, I'll just never forget the the films on music, the black and white films he did at the BBC, Sibelius, or the film he did on Rossetti, or Isadora Duncan, and certainly Women in Love and The Devils. I thought was fascinating. Derek Jarman's production design, and his use of music and his understanding of music and the way he made it possible for people who may not have been exposed to that understand, and also the lives of the composers themselves. I prefer some more than others, but the even the one on Coleridge was interesting. It was fascinating, and the documentary on the English folk song is terrific. And then he acted in a film in which he played a character who was in love with a stripper. I forget the name of the picture, about 20 years ago. It was really interesting. He's really good. And so, it's these films, I know that they're available, particularly the black and white ones are available on DVD here in England, but in America, these should be really shown again and reassessed, because it's quite extraordinary.
Well, without question, his most famous film in the United States is his film of the Who's rock opera Tommy. And in that film, he used a bunch of rock musicians from the 70s. He used Pete Townsend and Roger Daltrey. He used Elton John, Tina Turner, Eric Clapton, Keith Moon. So this was a big deal back in those days. The stars of the movie were Oliver Reed again and Anne Margaret. Anne Margaret looked great in this movie, by the way. Nice girl from Wilmette, Illinois. The story of how Oliver Reed got to star in the movie is actually quite interesting. Apparently, Oliver Reed was no longer worried about the size of his member, but he was worried about the fact that he wasn't a singer and wouldn't fit into this rock opera Tommy. So how he got to the movie and how he was able to star in it was part of a deal that he made with Ken Russell. And here is Ken Russell's son, who worked on the movie, telling how Ken Russell got Oliver Reed to star in Tommy.
Before Tommy was being shot, Oliver Reed didn't really want to be in the film because he hadn't really got a singing voice. So Keith Moon says, okay, we'll go down to his house, we'll go in my helicopter, and we'll make him do it. Because I think Keith Moon really wanted another drinking buddy to be in the film. So they get down to this big hall, which is Oliver Reed's big lair, I think it was somewhere in Surrey. And there was these two huge swords above the fireplace. And Oliver Reed said, okay, we're going to sword fight, and whoever draws blood first wins. So this big sword fight ensued with Keith Moon being the commentator.
What, between your dad
and Oliver Reed were having a sword fight. And whoever drew blood first, and you can imagine these big, great swords, and Ken nicked him just on the shirt. And he went, damn, okay, I'll do it. And I remember my father coming home. The next morning, there was this blood-stained shirt in the basket of clothes to be washed. And he said, Ollie's doing it, and just pointed to that.
Yeah, I'm sure there was a lot of drinking going on in that movie. There were some wild people in that one. Anyway, that's the story of Ken Russell. And we're going to close tonight with a piece from Tommy. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. And here's the overture from Tommy. You may not recognize his version. It's played by, who else? Liberace. So we say goodbye and thank you to Ken Russell.